Imagine this, you're standing on the shore of the heavenly island of Espiritu Santo. The year is 1945. Humid, salty air clings to your skin. Around you, turquoise water meets dazzling white coral sand and dense palm groves. World War II has just ended with a resounding victory, and the world breathes a collective sigh of relief. But instead of celebration, you witness something inexplicable, almost surreal. An American soldier, his face utterly blank, climbs into a brand new Jeep. He abruptly starts the engine, the screech of tires on metal piercing the tropical silence. He drives to the edge of a specially constructed pier and at full speed steers the vehicle into the ocean. In the last fraction of a second, he leaps out, perfectly timed. The Jeep plunges into the water with a heavy, dull splash, leaving only expanding ripples and iridescent oil slicks on the surface. Another Jeep follows, then another. Then bulldozers, trucks, cranes, a fortune in steel and engines capable of building a new world sinks before your eyes into the crystal-clear lagoon. What is this? An act of madness? A ritual burning of the idols of war? No, this was something far stranger and more frightening. It was a cold, sober, ruthless economic calculation. A decision made in the air-conditioned headquarters of the Pentagon, thousands of miles away. A decision delivered here by the dry crackle of a teletype. And the economic doctrine behind this act, at first glance, seems more absurd than simple insanity. Because sometimes, in a world of big money and global politics, a world ruled by the fear of deflation, destroying material value turns out to be more profitable than preserving it. This is the story of a place the local residents, observing this absurdity, ironically christened $1 Million Point. A spot on the map where three relentless forces converged, the industrial waste of a superpower, the desperate need of the small Vanuatu people, and the cynical, almost mathematical logic of the post-war economy. By the end of this story, you will understand how the fear of a price collapse in the US domestic market, a fear born from memories of the Great Depression, forced the army to sink a fortune, and how this decision, made in a single day, forever changed the fate, and even the ecology, of a small island in the Pacific. To understand this absurdity, we need to rewind a bit. Before the war, Espiritu Santo was a quiet backwater at the end of the world, a place where the air smelled of copra and hibiscus. It was part of the New Hebrides colony, somewhat inefficiently governed by both Britain and France. The local inhabitants, the Vanuatu people, lived in their villages, fished, and grew yams. Their world was slow, infinitely distant from world wars. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. Grey silhouettes of American ships appeared on the horizon, US Navy CB engineering battalions landed on the shore, and the deafening roar of caterpillar bulldozers forever drowned out the gentle sound of the surf. The idyllic island was about to become a war machine, an unbreakable cog in the giant Pacific mechanism. Why here, specifically? The answer is simple and undeniable: geography. Espiritu Santo had an ideal strategic location. A deep-water harbour protected from storms, enough flat land to build several runways capable of accommodating heavy B-17 bombers, and most importantly, it was outside the range of Japanese aircraft, but close enough to serve as a staging ground for offensives on the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. It became a colossal logistical hub, a supply depot, a repair base, button base, as the military called it, the heart of the entire South Pacific. The scale of this construction was astonishing, especially against the backdrop of untouched wilderness. It wasn't just a base. It was a full-fledged American city for 100,000 people, sprung up in the middle of the jungle. 5 coral-surfaced airfields, enormous floating docks capable of receiving a damaged battleship, hundreds of miles of roads cut through the rainforest, a 5,000-bed hospital, open-air cinemas showing films with Humphrey Bogart, factories bottling millions of Coca-Colas, industrial bakeries, colossal mechanical workshops. Over 500,000 American soldiers passed through this base. Everything needed for modern warfare, from Sherman tanks to toothbrushes, was brought here in unimaginable, excessive quantities. This gigantic machine, built for total war, was perfectly calibrated. It operated flawlessly, moving people and materials, but in their haste, no one had considered how to stop it. There was no deactivation protocol. And when the war ended so suddenly, with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs, this well-oiled mechanism transformed into a logistical time bomb, its silent clock already ticking. August 1945. News of Japan's surrender crackles across the island from army radios. It's a day of universal, deafening euphoria. Soldiers and sailors fire into the air, embrace, celebrate. The war, which seemed endless, is finally over. Everyone dreams of one thing: receiving demobilization orders and returning home. But the next morning, as the celebratory hangover fades, leaving a metallic taste in their mouths, staff officers look at maps, inventory lists, and overcrowded warehouses and airfields, and a cold dread grips them. Victory has created a problem of gigantic, unprecedented scale. This problem was called military surplus, a dry bureaucratic term for mountains of unwanted wealth. Everything accumulated on the island for 3 years instantly transformed from a strategic asset into a logistical nightmare, a red-hot anchor dragging down the American army. Thousands of tons of equipment, supplies and provisions that were no longer needed. Simply maintaining all of it in working condition in the aggressive tropical climate required thousands of man-hours, fuel and spare parts. But soldiers were being sent home en masse. Transport ships, which had previously carried cargo to the front, were now critically needed to bring troops back. The island, packed with riches, was becoming the world's most expensive and rust-prone warehouse. And it wasn't old, worn-out junk. Under tarpaulins in warehouses stood hundreds of brand-new Willys Jeeps, still in thick factory grease with only a few miles on them. Bulldozers that hadn't even worked 100 hours. New aircraft engines in sealed crates, mountains of uniforms, boxes of tools, construction materials, and even things absurd in their abundance like millions of bottles of Coca-Cola. According to archival reports, all this property was valued at a huge sum, many millions of dollars at the time's prices. Today, adjusted for inflation, it would be hundreds of millions. So you have an island overflowing with assets you no longer need, assets that are costing money every single day under tropical rain. What are the options? Send them home, sell them locally, or simply get rid of them? The American military faced a classic zugzwang, a situation where any move leads to a worse position, a choice that seemed obvious but turned out to be an intricate economic trap. Imagine that officer from the Quartermaster Corps. Night, humid heat, moths swarm in the light of a single lamp. He's not a villain. He's not a vandal. He is simply looking at columns of figures in a report labelled Logistical Surplus Analysis. And these figures add up to one relentless, paradoxical, almost inhuman conclusion. There were 2 reasons for this conclusion, both as solid as a Sherman tank's armour. First, the simple cost of transportation. Just calculate it. To load a bulldozer onto a ship, transport it halfway across the world to America, unload it and deliver it to a warehouse cost, by calculation, 15 to 20% more than the catalogue price of the bulldozer itself. Think about it. Bringing an item home cost more than the item was worth. Wartime economics doesn't look at price tags, but in peacetime every dollar counts. And the second reason was even more serious. It was ingrained in the mind of every politician in Washington, the ghost of the Great Depression. If all these thousands of cheap, almost free jeeps and tractors flooded the domestic market, they would simply kill it. Factories in Detroit, which had just begun retooling from tank production to tractors, would go bankrupt that very month. Thousands of workers, just returned from the front, would be jobless. This fear was so powerful that it was codified into law, the 1944 Surplus Property Act. And here it is, the main shocking conclusion of this ruthless mathematics. To protect the economy and jobs of thousands of Americans at home, the wealth here had to be physically destroyed. Destroyed, even though it could have saved and transformed the lives of thousands of people on this island. The cold logic of the system entered into a direct, irresolvable conflict with simple human logic. It was an act of economic protectionism taken to an absolute grotesque absurdity. The interests of the distant metropole didn't just outweigh, they annulled the very reality of those who stood by and silently watched. But there was another option. A last chance to avoid this catastrophe: sell everything locally, even for a pittance, at least not to drown it in the ocean. Negotiations with the island's colonial authorities, the British and the French, had already begun, and it seemed that common sense was about to triumph over this cold madness. Imagine the room, a stuffy barracks. The air is thick with heat, cigar smoke, and the smell of repellent. A fan creaks lazily overhead, doing little to alleviate the stifling humidity, merely stirring the stuffiness across sweaty faces. On one side of the table, American quartermaster officers. Their uniforms are faded from sun and salt. Their faces are tired, worn out. They just need to close this chapter, write off the headache, and get some money back into the treasury. Opposite them, British and French colonial officials, pristine, starched suits without a single crease, smug smiles. They feel they hold all the cards. They can practically sell the American desperation, and they decide to play their favourite colonial game, waiting it out. The Americans lay their cards on the table. They offer to buy everything: jeeps, bulldozers, generators, construction materials for 6 cents on the dollar, 6% of the real value. This isn't just a discount, it's practically a giveaway. But the colonial authorities are convinced the Americans have nowhere else to go, that they can press harder, squeeze more. They begin to intentionally drag out the time. Weeks turn into a month. They wait for the Yankees, exhausted by logistics and pressure from Washington, to simply abandon everything, hand over the keys to this treasure trove for free, and sail home. It was a fatal miscalculation, an error born of pure colonial arrogance. One day, the officials make their counteroffer. It is so ridiculously low that the Americans perceive it not as a negotiation, but as a direct insult, a slap in the face. And at that moment, everything changes. For the United States Army, which had just won a world war, it ceases to be a question of money. It becomes a matter of principle, a matter of national pride. No one would wipe their feet on the Stars and Stripes. The American colonel's gaze turns icy. If this wealth won't go to them at a fair, albeit low price, it won't go to anyone. The deal is off. No handshakes exchanged. Patience snap like an old, over-tightened rope. The last chance to save this fortune was lost. And directly from that stuffy negotiation room, an order is issued. Short, clear, irreversible. Begin the liquidation operation. The point of no return has been passed. In the ensuing silence, only the scratch of a pen is heard, a pen signing the directive that would go down in history as one of the most grotesque acts of economic vandalism. And this is what that directive looked like in reality. A crudely built pier of coral limestone sliced into the turquoise surface of the lagoon. It stretched far out to sea, to where a 30-metre depth lay hidden beneath the azure surface. A young soldier, barely over 20, got behind the wheel of a brand new Willys Jeep. Key in the ignition. The engine roared to life with a rich, low rumble that vibrated through the entire pier deck. The air was thick, smelling of diesel and salt, but the soldier wasn't driving on a road. He steered the vehicle straight for the edge. Ahead lay only the dazzling sun reflecting on the water. This was not chaotic madness. It was an icy, methodical conveyor belt of destruction, organised with military precision. Watch. The driver accelerates the truck down a specially built ramp. He rigidly locks the steering wheel with a makeshift fastener to ensure the vehicle drives straight. And at the last possible moment, just before the front wheels plunge into the void, he leaps from the cab onto the pier planks. The truck, by inertia, continues its path. A second of unnatural flight. Then a deafening, dull impact shatters the silence. This is followed by a furious hiss of steam as the superheated metal meets the cold water. An iridescent slick spreads on the surface, and above, the screeching is already audible. The next one waits. This continued for weeks, from 1945 to 1947, from morning to evening under the scorching equatorial sun, hundreds of times a day, the roar of an engine, a short acceleration, the driver's sharp jump, and a dull impact on the water, followed by a ringing silence. And another vehicle disappeared forever into the depths. For the soldiers it was work, a routine causing acute cognitive dissonance. Imagine, just yesterday, you risked your life to deliver this truck with ammunition to the front line, and today your job is to dispassionately sink it. It was perhaps the most absurd and psychologically exhausting routine in human history, preserving life in war, only to methodically kill inanimate but perfectly functional objects afterward. There, underwater, the steel giants died in silence, slowly becoming covered in silt and corals, but on the shore in the shade of coconut palms stood those who watched this methodical madness, the local residents, the Ni Vanuatu. For them, this bulldozer was not surplus, it was a road to their village. This generator was light in their huts, and their frozen tense silence was louder than the roar of engines and the splashes of water. Imagine this man. Let's call him Matai. His bare feet feel the warmth of the volcanic sand. All his life he walked narrow paths, laid by his ancestors through the suffocating jungle. And then he saw them, the yellow gods of steel, the caterpillar bulldozers. In one day they did what would have taken his gang. village generations. He saw how these machines created roads from nothing, created airstrips, created entire cities. For him, this bulldozer was not just a machine, it was a promise that his children could reach a doctor, that his village could sell copra at the market. And now he watches. He watches as one of these new shiny gods, which could have paved the way to his future, clumsily drives off the pier, tips over, and with a heavy, dying sigh sinks. In his eyes, it's not just bewilderment, it's a funeral. A silent, solemn funeral for a promised future. This spectacle forever seared a brand onto the collective soul of the islanders. They saw beings who came from the sky, who brought unimaginable treasures, canned goods, chocolate, lighters, Coca-Cola, and who now, with equally incomprehensible ease, destroyed these treasures, the very cargo. Imagine their world, a world of yams and canoes and a world of jeeps and radios. The chasm between them was so vast that the only explanation was supernatural. It was here, on this soil, that the seeds of the cargo cults that swept across Melanesia took root, like the John Frum cult on the neighbouring island of Tanna. These are religions whose followers believe that one day their ancestors or gods will return on iron birds and bestow everything upon them again. For them, the destruction of equipment at $1 Million Point was not an economic calculation. It was a sacred, incomprehensible ritual whose meaning only the gods knew. And therein lies the deepest, cruelest irony. The Americans, guided by their law, thought they were erasing value from a balance sheet. They were destroying material goods to avoid economic problems at home, thousands of miles away. But by this act, they created something far more enduring, a myth. They drowned steel but left behind a psychological wound and a legend that whispered in quiet evenings around the fire, lives on this island to this day. Tragedy became legend, waste became religion. But what became of the dump itself, the tons of metal abandoned at the bottom of the ocean, the millions of bottles that became homes for marine life? Imagine, present day, you dive into the warm, perfectly clear water. Slowly you descend into the blue abyss, feeling the pressure build in your ears. Around you only the steady gurgle of your regulator. And suddenly shapes emerge from the darkness. It's a GMC truck. It stands on its wheels as if ready to drive, but its hood and body are thickly overgrown with vibrant anemones and brain corals. A school of colourful parrotfish swims out of a broken cabin window. This is no longer a dump. It's a silent underwater mausoleum, a place where nature slowly, cell by cell, reclaims the traces of human madness. Over time, $1 Million Point has become a magnet for divers from all over the world. Its popularity is second only to the giant liner President Coolidge, which also sank nearby. And here is the paradox. What was once a symbol of absurd destruction has become a unique tourist attraction. The sunken equipment, written off to avoid crashing prices, ultimately brought money to the island. The tourism industry that grew around this rusty grave now supports hundreds of local families. History has made an incredible economic turn. But this legacy also has a dark, toxic side. On one hand, a unique underwater park. On the other, thousands of tons of rusting metal slowly poisoning the ocean. Fuel tanks, oil residues, lead from batteries, asbestos from brake pads, all of it slowly seeping into the water. $1 Million Point is not only a monument to waste, it is a ticking ecological time bomb, and it ticks at the bottom of a paradisiacal lagoon under the indifferent gaze of tropical fish. History has come full circle. What was destroyed out of fear of money now brings money, but threatens an ecological disaster that will require even more money. It's time to put all the pieces of this puzzle together to understand the $1 million lesson this story has taught us, a lesson that lies at the very bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Let's trace this daisy chain. Military necessity transformed a quiet island into a giant warehouse. Sudden victory turned this warehouse into a multi-million-dollar logistical nightmare. Fear of the US domestic market collapse made destroying equipment more profitable than saving it. Colonial greed ruined the last deal. Ultimately, impeccable economic logic led to an absolutely irrational act of destruction. And decades later, this act spawned a paradoxical legacy, a tourism boom and an environmental threat. Each step in this chain is logical, but the entire chain is a perfect example of systemic madness. But this isn't just a story about rusting metal. It's a story about people trapped in a system. Imagine that American officer who gave the order. Perhaps for the rest of his life he wasn't haunted by the roar of battle, but by that repetitive, dull thud of metal hitting water and the smell of salty rust. Now imagine Matai. He lived his life telling his children and grandchildren about the iron gods who came from the sky, bestowed a miracle, and then drowned it themselves. For one, it was an order fulfilled. For the other, a sacred revelation. Both became hostages to a soulless economic machine. So what is $1 Million Point? Just a strange historical curiosity and mistake of the past? Or is it an eternal mirror into which you and I are looking right now? A mirror reflecting our civilization, a civilization that has learned to produce on unimaginable scales, but has never learned to distribute wisely. A civilization whose economic model demands constant growth, forcing us to produce and discard more than we can consume or recycle. Perhaps this underwater memorial is not just a monument to World War II. Perhaps it's the prototype of all our modern landfills, from the mountains of electronics in Ghana to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Now imagine yourself in the shoes of that American officer, in your hand an order printed on official paper. You know that carrying it out means protecting your country's economy from chaos, protecting thousands of jobs, but you also see the hundreds of eyes of the local residents, for whom just one of those bulldozers is a whole life. You feel their silent, questioning gaze on your skin. What would you choose? To fulfill the order or to follow your conscience? Duty to an abstract system or compassion for a specific person? There is no single right answer here, and that perhaps is the $1 million lesson.